Kenny Pickett had a lot to say about the Steelers offense when he was on Cam Heyward's podcast. We'll talk about his confidence and take your calls here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Jenna Harner today. Welcome to the Friday episode. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And as I said before, we're joined by Jenna Harner of Channel 11 WPXI. Jenna, it's great to have you back.
Great to be back. Sorry for the absence last week. It was the Shania Twain concert, and
that's what concert you went to.
I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you. Yeah, Shania Twain. My childhood memories, everything was brought back. She put on a great show.
Well, that's actually hilarious. It's also really funny how I have a few friends that went and they were like, "Yes, so I'm still hungover," and that was like Friday. So that was actually pretty funny. But let's get into.
Crazy.
Yeah, sorry. That's what I heard. No, you're fine. But let's get into some talking points here, because Kenny Pickett recently went on Cam Heyward's Not Just Football podcast, and Cam Heyward brought up some of the criticisms that have been made about the Steelers offense, and Kenny Pickett had some interesting things to say about that. One, he was like, first of all, where did you hear that? He's like, I'm excited where the offense went this spring, and he thinks it'll be good. Now, we all know in practice, Cam Heyward is like terrorizing the Steelers offense, and whenever they're getting stops and 7 shots, he's like saying like, Kenny, you guys didn't score. He's messing with them. He's messing with Najee. He's messing with everybody. But that's part of what Cam Heyward does as a leader. He wants to antagonize you and pull the best out of you. But part of what I thought was really interesting about Kenny Pickett was we talked about the different formations and the different ways that the Steelers plan to use him, and how he's become so much more comfortable with all the phases of it. And he talked about the different things that he likes to use as far as the different formations. And he said, quote, "I think it's great to be able to work under both." He said, when he talked about shotgun and under center, he said, I love working under center and in the gun, and then adding play action to it. You can get me on the move from both, and the versatility from it, and what I can do for what I can do what the team can do. I think that this is a good system for us. Jenna, I think we saw a little bit. There were times when Kenny Pickett things started to click for him last year, but it took time for him to get there. And it was still kind of obvious, even in the later games, like there were certain things that he wasn't just automatic with. What is your expectations for how we'll see that work into training camp and then when the season starts?
Well, for me, we know how big of a year this is going to be for not only Kenny Pickett, but this offense as a whole, Matt Canada as well. Just what is this offense going to look like? How are they going to take that step forward where they're going to need to put more points up? I think the fact that Kenny Pickett is going to have the entirety of the offseason, there's not a quarterback battle like there was last year. There's no uncertainty of who's going to start. When is Kenny Pickett's time going to come? It's here, it's now. So he has the full benefit of getting to work with all of his guys throughout spring ball. And then again, we're coming into training camp here. I mean, this is going to be, he's taking those first team reps. He didn't get an entire week of first team reps every single day at practice until week 5 last year. Yep. When they were playing the Buffalo Bills. So I think that this is really good, solid starting ground for him just to be able to get comfortable with everything, because we know as an offense, and especially as a young player, a rookie quarterback at that, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to understand. The verbiage, just how the offense, how the schemes work and the playbook and things along those lines. And I really think that this is going to be something where when you have the ability, like Kenny Pickett does right now, to work through the entirety of the offseason, all of training camp, taking those first team reps, it's really going to be beneficial. He's going to have, in my opinion, I think a much better grasp on the offense than he did just a year ago.
And even just beyond the offense itself, also, I think an understanding of his teammates and who they are and how to work with them. There's several things that need to happen. You need to develop a rapport with guys. There's lots of timing. There's understanding of where to put the ball when you're throwing it, when they like to get open with different routes they are. There's so many things that go into the minutia of how football works. It's why it's a fascinating game. It's why there's so many people like myself who get paid to analyze it, because there's so many parts to analyze. And that's where we're looking at Kenny Pickett. How much more can he grasp this year? And I think it's very fair to talk about his level of comfort with Matt Canada and the offense. And he's backed up Matt Canada before. That's something that he said he likes working in this system. He's excited about where it can go. And I think that's where there's that split between Kenny Pickett and what he's saying and what a lot of Steelers fans feel, because a lot of Steelers fans, they don't like Matt Canada because the Steelers offense has been ranked towards the bottom of the league since he took over. Granted, Ben Roethlisberger's last year, Kenny Pickett's first year, there's transition there. But I just wonder, are we going to be at a point this time next year where this is going to be like an all forgotten thing, and we're going to be like, man, everyone's going to forget that Kenny Pickett stood up for Matt Canada? Or do you think, Jenna, that Matt Canada gets to stick around and it's because of Kenny Pickett if they are able to have success this year?
And well, that's the $1 million question, right? It's just going to be, how successful can this offense be this season? And look, on paper right now, it sounds great. You have Diontae Johnson coming back. And I know people want to look at, last year he didn't have any touchdowns. It was still such a fluke, in my opinion. And I think Kenny Pickett talked about that as well. Just, how Diontae is a guy that can always get open. He's a really, really talented guy. And there was just some miscues and there were just some misses. I mean, what was it, the last game of the season against the Browns? He should have at least had a touchdown. I mean, those little things where it's like, it was just a weird year. And when we talked with Diontae at minicamp, he was thrilled. He's so excited to be able to get back out there and to, he's been putting in so much work. So I think his level of what he's coming in with this year, those two are going to be on the same page a lot more than we saw them last season. But then again, you have George Pickens, who is in his second year. You have the return of Calvin Austin, who we have yet to see. And I know we're going to deep dive into kind of the entirety of receivers, but I think with how young this offense is, every step that they can take, every lesson that they can learn up, that they have learned up to this point, is something that's going to be really beneficial. Because again, with young players, you're taking that next step every single year, it seems like, and you're getting to the point where, okay, you're comfortable in the system. You understand where you need to be, the route you need to run, things along those lines. What is going to make this offense click? And so, I mean, all of this is really going to be, how successful can this offense be? Can they finish drives? Because I know that there was a ton of discussion about, okay, they were really good, in between the 20s, but once they got into the red zone, the lack of finishing there was something that this team is going to absolutely need to come away with here. But I mean, if this offense takes steps forward and we see more consistency from them, if we see, Kenny Pickett not being, I don't want to say like handcuffed, because I don't think that's the right word, but Kenny Pickett in his ability to be able to find guys like Diontae and George Pickens deep, while also, when they on 3rd and 5, when they need 5, get 6. That's going to be something I think is going to be really crucial for the success of this offseason. But it really does, or the success of this season, the offense this season, but it really does depend on what Kenny Pickett does. And I think in turn, Matt Canada and the two combined is really going to be what's going to be the potential for this offense this season.
Certainly. And I want to talk about the aspect of the push and pull of, how much they lean on Kenny Pickett versus the run game that they've been developing. And in fact, Kenny Pickett talked about Najee Harris as well during that Cam Heyward podcast. We'll talk about that in a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer. And what you get to do with Vinny is that he's going to be giving you lots of great insight into fantasy advice all season long. So we're breaking things down for you here on the Locked On Podcast Network, along with eBay Motors, to give you guys guaranteed fits for fantasy picks of the week all season long. This week we're looking at some different options here. You can look to take a smooth turn in fantasy football snake drafts with the last pick of the first round and the first pick of the second round. And you'd be guaranteed to have two of the surest performers by going all AFC West with Raiders wide receiver Davante Adams and Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes. Adams has proved he remains a reliable top selection in Las Vegas, while Mahomes again will operate with both of the highest floor and ceiling among the standout luxury options at his position. When it comes to eBay Motors, you get the guaranteed fit of having over 122 million parts and accessories available for your vehicle right at your fingertips. You can make sure that your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternators, shocks, struts, you name it, eBay Motors has it. And they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car, because eBay Guaranteed Fit helps you understand exactly what parts you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forth, switch gears, crank the AC, and say goodbye to sweating out if your ride needs a little fixing up, because now you know you'll always be set for success from the get-go. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guarantee Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm Chris Carter. She's Jenna Harner. We're breaking things down here on your Pittsburgh Steelers here. Now, Jenna, getting back to part of what we're talking about there, you talked about the reins allowed that Kenny Pickett's allowed to have on this offense. We talked a little bit about that with Mark Caboli earlier this week, but I want to address the way that Kenny Pickett talked about Najee Harris on Cam Heyward's Not Just Football podcast. By the way, go check that out. Great stuff as always on that show. Kenny Pickett, when addressing, he said, I love it. He's especially with Najee. There's a give and take to it. If you have a really good running game, you can trust the defense is going to take it. So if the run game is not too good and those guys don't set up, then that's where we have a problem. But coming off the spring and what we did, I'm excited to get to camp. And I think that there is that unknown excitement that Kenny Pickett has is, can this offensive line not only pick up where it left off last year, but be better with the additions of Broderick Jones and Isaac Seumalo, presumably to the starting positions on the left side of the line there. Because if the Steelers are going with a run game and their run game is really getting to it, it changes up the dynamic of how much you need Kenny Pickett. And see, here's the thing. Jenna, I've professed this a lot. I have confidence that Kenny Pickett will develop into a successful starting franchise NFL quarterback for the Steelers. However, I also think he still needs to be eased into it. I don't think he's just going to pop off this year and be an NFL MVP. But I think that if the Steelers develop a strong ground game, it will allow him to kind of pick his spots when he has to play at a higher level and grow in a more natural way instead of trying to lean on him and just have him throw the ball all game long. And that will be key for his development to become the quarterback that they eventually want him to be.
And that's such a great point, right? Because you look at some of the guys that have had success in the league, and obviously quarterbacks are very different, and we're seeing that kind of across the board. But I feel like there's a lot of guys who, when they're not just thrown into the fire and say, hey, ready, set, go, when it's a team that has a really solid offensive line, a team that has that balance between the pass game and the run game, and a team that has a defense that can kind of, stay out there, can limit drives by your opponent, limit points by your opponent, then it's that balance where you're not asking your quarterback to do too much. You're not asking him to every single time have to go and win the game on a Hail Mary type of drive. And we did see a lot of, really good things from Kenny Pickett towards the end of the season with his ability to win those game-winning drives, or to lead those game-winning drives and win those games. But again, you don't want to put too much on him. And yes, I know people will say, okay, well, it's the NFL, it's a quarterback, you should be able to do that. But in terms of development doesn't just, it's not just a snap your finger type thing and it's done here. There's a lot still. Kenny Pickett will be the first to tell you he still wants to learn. He still wants to grow in, because they're never done in that sense. So I think it's going to be, if you can have that balance with the run game, which I really do think this team is going to be able to have, just again, building on what they did last season with the additions also of the guys that they added. on the line that's no doubt going to make this line stronger and better than it was last year, then you're lessening the load on Kenny Pickett a little bit, and you're giving him the ability to get more comfortable as each week goes, you know, things like that.
I'm right with you. As they build that comfort level that you're talking about there, we'll see how they play off each other, because that's something that, like, for example, we talk about the Killer B era of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Killer B era kind of manifested pretty quickly once Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown got started for the Steelers. Brown kind of worked his way into it for a while. You know, 2013 was his first big year after being with the Steelers for like 3 seasons or so. And then Le'Veon Bell was drafted in 2013, but 2014 was when it all started to really click and everyone recognized, like, oh, that's a talented trio right there with those two guys and Ben Roethlisberger. And then it was kind of like once it took time, because it took time for Le'Veon Bell to figure out, how does he fit with Ben Roethlisberger? How do they balance him with Antonio Brown, and keeping all of those stars on the same page and making that an offense that works? And that's something that this group needs to do. And let's put this, I'm saying this right now, I'm not saying that the Steelers have a Killer B type of situation lined up for this offense right now, because Antonio Brown was the best receiver in football. Le'Veon Bell was arguably the best running back in football, and Ben Roethlisberger was one of the best quarterbacks in football. So you had that trio. I'm not saying that the Steelers will establish that kind of a trio this year, but I do think the Steelers, you know, that is an example of how it takes chemistry to build those things, and it took time for them to figure that out. If this is the year the Steelers do figure out that chemistry with, let's say, Pickett, Harris, and Pickens, that could be the key to making this a long-term solution for the offense, because right now the Steelers defense is still the leading part of this team. As much as everyone is excited to see Kenny Pickett and George Pickens and this offense with Broderick Jones on the offensive line and everything, as much as everyone's excited to see that group grow, it's the defense that's going to win games most of the time for this team this year. But they need to develop the offensive core for the future, because this defense has a lot of players on it who, there's some young guys on it. Joey Porter Jr. was just drafted, but TJ Watt's in his late 20s. Minka Fitzpatrick's in his mid to late 20s. Cam Heyward's in his mid 30s. There's a lot of guys that are essential to that defense that won't be there in 5 to 6 years, or will be on the tail end of their careers, which means when that time comes, if the Steelers haven't hit on another defensive player of the year type player like TJ Watt or another guy like that, they're going to need the offense to be the group that carries them through games. And that's where I think that right now is going to be very important to see what guys step up in the kind of chemistry you talked about with the push and pull of figuring out each other's comfort levels.
And look, I mean, the last handful of years, I feel like even you can go back to, you know, the last couple, I would say Ben's last year, but it felt like this team, at least from my perspective, covering this team, that the defense has been the unit that's been leaned on the most in terms of, okay, well, this defense is going to get things done. This defense is going to get that final stop. This defense is going to have that pick six that's going to end the game, those types of things, where it's been a lot of focus on the defense is the unit that's going to win these games for this team. And I think that might have contributed to the sense of where the Steelers have been the last couple of years. Yes, they have not been under 500, but there hasn't been that playoff success. And to get there, this offense is going to need to, I don't want to say pull their weight, because obviously, but the offense is going to need to match where the defense is. And they're going to need to be a unit that you can depend on to score. And yes, it's not going to happen every drive. That's just the reality of the NFL. But can this offense sustain drives? Can this offense march down the field, take time off the clock, using the run game? And when it matters most, find the end zone. When you get into the red zone, this offense is going to have to finish in order to pull, just to create more of that balance, because you see teams, I mean, you look at teams like the Chiefs, like the Bills, like the contenders of the AFC, even the Dolphins. I know a lot of people talk about them too in that way. Those teams have that balance that I think the Steelers can get to, but it's just going to be a matter of what this offense is going to look like in order for them to get to that point.
I'm right with you on that. And to get to that point, just to be clear, Jenna's not saying they need to be number one, they need to be a top 10 offense. We're just talking about being in the middle part of the league, because if they are that, if they can get to the middle part of the league, that puts them, that creates that balance that we're talking about here when we're talking about scoring. The Steelers scored on average 18.1 points per game this year, and I've made this point before. That ranked 26th in the NFL. But if they were to say, just on average, turn one field goal drive into a touchdown drive, just on an average per game basis, just finishing better in the red zone than they did last year. And again, one drive, we're not asking for a whole lot there. That is a 4-point boost per game, let's say on average. That means they would go from averaging 18.1 points per game to 22.1 points per game, which would make them, according to last year's numbers, the 14th best offense in the NFL. That is what we're talking about here. And again, we're just talking on an average basis. That doesn't mean that every game they'll score 22 points and that's all they can do. But we're saying that if they find that, that will put them right in the middle and on the cusp of, the group that's just outside of the top 10 offenses in the NFL. That, I think, is doable if this group has some solid natural growth this year. And that's what we're looking forward to see from the Pittsburgh Steelers, if they can do that. I want to get to some questions here that we have from our fans on the Locked On Steelers podcast. We'll talk about that with Jenna Harner in a minute here. So don't go anywhere. Chris Carter, Jenna Harner here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Jenna Harner of Channel 11 WPXI. Jenna, want to get to this question from one of our fans. We have, and we sometimes do get out of the country calls here. Remember, you can always call in to our call-in line 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We'll try to get you on the show. And if you donate to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation campaign, you're guaranteed an on-air answer. Let's get to this question. We have our man Bruce Stack all the way out from Sotocano, Honduras, with a question about the Steelers offense. Here's Bruce.
Hey, Chris. Big fan of the show. Bruce Stack from Sotocano Air Base in Honduras. And I had a question regarding the wide receiver room. How do you see this wide receiver playing out when we got Diontae Johnson, George Pickens, Allen Robinson, Calvin Austin, Gunnar Olszewski, Miles Boykin? It just seems completely loaded. Thanks.
First of all, thank you, Bruce, and thank you for your service, for serving our country. We appreciate you and all our servicemen in this country, men and women. Jenna, I want to get to this question with you because we've talked a lot about the receivers and what this room is going to look like. Everyone is kind of settled in on Diontae Johnson 1, George Pickens 2, with them hoping to be with George Pickens hoping to kind of step up and challenge Diontae Johnson as maybe he's the better receiver there. But behind him is where it gets interesting, because there's a lot of assumptions that Allen Robinson's the number 3, and I think he will be the number 3. But Calvin Austin's speed was a very excited point that we were all talking about leading into last training camp as the guy there. Is there a legitimate chance, or do you foresee Calvin Austin and his maybe speed and playmaking ability becoming a bigger factor for the Steelers than, say, the veteran skills and gamesmanship of Allen Robinson at getting open for Kenny Pickett in the middle part of the field?
I think there's definitely a potential to see that. And I think that's something that's going to be really intriguing to watch, not only throughout training camp, but as the season progresses, is how these guys are implemented into this offense. And again, back to what this offense is going to look like, but how their roles are going to elevate what this offense can get to. And I mean, we know there's so much talk about, okay, Calvin Austin is going to be a jet sweep guy, and Allen Robinson's potentially going to be a slot guy, and all of those little very nuances there. But I think there's a legitimate chance that, again, with a better offensive line, you see more openings for a guy like Calvin Austin. And again, we've seen him throughout, OTAs, minicamp, things like that, but we have not seen him in the training camp setting. It's so wild to think, because there's been so much talk about him for, since the minute he was drafted. And now it's like, okay, we're really going to get to see what this guy is capable of. And you hear his offensive teammates talk so highly of him. But at the same time, a guy like Allen Robinson, who can kind of, I think we talked about this too, be a little bit more of a quote unquote security blanket for Kenny Pickett, where it's like, hey, he looks through his options and Diontae is covered and Pickens is, not, his route hasn't developed enough yet, and he has to get rid of the ball. Finding a guy like Robinson over the middle that's going to be this solid, option consistently, where it's, hey, if you need me, I'm here, depending on the scheme, depending on what's going on. But I think there's a balance for both. And I think that that's what this offense is going to need too. It's going to need both of those guys to not be massive playmakers, but just to make consistent plays. And I think consistency really defines what we're going to hope to see from this offense this year. Again, if they're finishing drives and they're, have one fewer field goal than they did a season ago, and that can be a touchdown instead of a field goal, this team is going to look different. This team is going to be in different conversations.
Yeah, I think it does look different when we're talking about that. One thing that the Steelers, I think that used to be a thing for the Steelers is that big playability, that ability to just, hey, on any given play, a bomb could happen and a receiver breaks open, you get that 50-yard touchdown. We haven't seen that as much of late. That was definitely a thing in the Antonio Brown era, even with Juju Smith-Schuster a little bit until he got, a lot of his injuries. But bringing that back to the Steelers offense, I think the last time that they really had that as a serious factor was in the middle part of the 2020 season when Ben Roethlisberger still was looking healthy that year, and he was able to connect with Diontae Johnson and Juju Smith-Schuster and James Washington and guys at different parts of the field. But Kenny Pickett, I know people get on him for his hand size, and they say, oh, he can't throw the ball, as far as some of as like Patrick Mahomes and stuff. Kenny Pickett can hit a deep ball. I've seen him do it a lot at Pitt. And we saw him do it a little bit for the Steelers last year. I think that he is going to have the opportunities to, especially if this run game gets going. Teams are going to have to start committing to try to stop Najee Harris a little bit more. They're gonna be faked out by play action, and it's gonna get some open looks for Kenny Pickett. And if they're able to capitalize on that with some bigger plays there, that again stretches the defense out more, forces them to honor a lot more, and then it creates the balance that you're talking about there, Jenna, where people have to consider a lot here. So you're right. Allen Robinson is a guy where they need a veteran who knows how to get open. And the Steelers have had guys like that over the years. Jericho Cotchery in the early 2010s was brought in for Ben Roethlisberger as they were working through Mike Wallace, Emmanuel Sanders, Antonio Brown, and figuring out who of that crew they were going to keep. But they needed a veteran to kind of stabilize things. That's who I think Allen Robinson is, as a Jericho Cotchery type who can come in, give you some really good, hard-fought minutes, and be a solid guy to rely on. But they want Calvin Austin to be a home run hitter. They want more home run hitters, period, in their offense. And that's what I think that the balance is going to be, is a security blanket, an emergency dump off type of player who will fight for the hard yards and get those plays, versus a guy who stretches the field, or even if he catches it in a wide receiver screen, he's liable to break one because of how fast and explosive he is.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the guy that had 4.3 40 speed. Correct me if I'm wrong there, something in that range.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just beyond filthy, and that's something that the Steelers are going to absolutely look to utilize in this offense and give them looks that they necessarily didn't have last year. Because I think just on paper, this offense and these guys, the receivers particularly, it's a step up from where they were a year ago. And when you add in, again, the fact that Kenny Pickett is in his second season, he's had a decent chunk of the year where he was starting. He learned on the fly a lot. He learned through mistakes a lot as well. But I think this is going to be one of those things where there should be more balance here offensively. And I think we're going to see that again as we work kind of through training camp here and get into the first, handful weeks of the season.
I'm right with you. There's a lot of things to be excited about this season, where we're going to see a lot of different factors. Training camp is next week. That's crazy. That is crazy to think about when we're talking about this. Players report, I believe, on the 26th, and then we start to see guys lining up on the 27th. We will be there, the Locked On Steelers podcast. We're very excited to talk about that. So, Jenna, thanks so much. You'll be there at training camp as well. As we get more of the insights as what's happening with the Pittsburgh Steelers at training camp. Jenna, thanks so much for joining us as always. We love having you on the Friday episodes. We look forward to having you again next week as we figure out the madness of Latrobe and St. Vincent College. But let people know they can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
Well, thank you for having me. As always, it is such a pleasure to be here on a Friday with you, Chris, and all of you listeners and viewers. You can find me on Twitter at Jenna Harner 11, Instagram Jenna_Harner, and WPXI locally in Pittsburgh. We're going to be at training camp. We're going to have tons of content for you guys. So all the players in the locker room that you want to hear from, Alex Highsmith and his contract situation, what's going to happen there, Kenny Pickett as he gets set for training camps. There's so many storylines where I'm stoked. I can't wait.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, and there's a lot of things to be excited about. That's why I'm finally excited to get to that point of the season there. Thanks again to Jenna, and thanks again for coming on, and thank you all for joining us here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. You can also check out this show Monday through Friday here on the Locked On Podcast Network, the Locked On Steelers podcast, giving you your team every day. Just a reminder, I said this earlier in the week, this show was pre-recorded on Tuesday, so if there's something that happened and it's not here, it's because I'm on vacation. I like a vacation, please.
Let the man enjoy his
break.
time.
I'm going to enjoy some time off. So shout out to all our fans. I know y'all riding with us. We appreciate y'all. We'll be back Monday with more here on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Thanks again for checking out the Locked On Steelers podcast. We'll see you then.